Still on roll.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sergeant Stiger, where we left off, I think we were talking about how bystanders began to congregate around the event, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you would agree that over the course of time, the bystanders, some of the bystanders who were observing the event became more excited.
More concerned, I would phrase it.
Their voices grew louder.
Yes.
They began using, they began name calling, essentially.
Correct.
And as that increased, or as the time went on, the intensity of the crowd increased.
Yes, they became more concerned.
Now, we looked at, I'm going to talk about Exhibit 110, if we could publish 110. So this again being what some people would call the use of force continuum, or what the Minneapolis Police Department calls the Defense and Control Response Training Guide, correct?
Yes.
Essentially, this is a graphic illustration in terms of, based upon a subject's behavior, how much force is authorized, correct?
Correct.
The onus or the focus being on the suspect's behavior initially, correct?
Correct.
And the response to that behavior, right?
Correct.
Now, again, we don't look at a use of force in a vacuum, right?
No, we do not.
We don't look at it, you know, in singular frames, right?
Correct.
We look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And an officer, a reasonable officer, would take into consideration what has happened with the suspect a few minutes ago, correct?
Correct.
And try to use that information to inform what could potentially happen in the future. Agreed?
Agreed.
That's what reasonable officers do.
Yes.
So if I'm a police officer and me and my two partners just 2 minutes ago were fighting with someone, right? And our efforts became futile, right? That's going to affect how we perceive might happen in the future with that, what we perceive might happen in the future with that person.
It's something to be concerned about, correct?
Right. Because, in fact, oftentimes people who become compliant after a struggle start to struggle again, right?
In certain instances, yes.
It happens, right?
Yes, it does.
Someone who said, almost to like catch their wind again, right? And start fighting again, right?
In certain instances, yes, but in most cases, officers are trained that you can only go by what the suspect's actions are at the time. You can't say, oh, well, I thought he or she was going to do this, so then I'm going to use this force. Okay. It has to be based on their actions.
An officer's use of force can exceed the suspect's use of force, right?
The
suspect's behaviors, right?
Yes.
That's the design, correct?
In certain instances, yes, it has to be proportional.
Right, meaning this concept of proportionality. If I call you a name, and I'm a police, or if I call you a name, and you're a police officer, you can't pull your gun out and shoot me, right?
Correct.
That would be a disproportionate use of force to the threat I
Perceived, yes.
Right. And so the mere fact that force is being applied, it's not second by second. We have to look at it in a longer context, right?
Yes, but you are constantly reassessing during that time frame.
Constantly reassessing. Now, I presume you've gone through firearms training,
Yes.
and I presume that you have had situations where you, in your firearms training, are confronted with multiple threats, right?
Yes.
And your training teaches you to deal with the most active threat, right?
Correct. Or the closest threat.
The closest threat or the biggest threat, right?
Correct.
And so you want to neutralize or contend with that potential threat before you deal with the lesser threats.
Yes.
right? And again, in this, this cycle, the critical decision-making model, that's coming both in terms of what you're dealing with in the suspect, right? That critical decision-making model is occurring.
Yes.
It's dealing with what's around you and what you're observing around you,
Your
right?
environment, yes.
It's dealing with other people that may be there, right?
Yes.
And it's dealing with using that same model to take all of your training and experience and things of that nature too, right?
Correct.
So there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions being made every nanosecond almost, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And simply because a person is not fighting with you, right? If I'm not fighting with you, that doesn't mean you still can't use some sort of force to control me, right?
It depends on the circumstance.
According to the Minneapolis Police Department, if someone is passively resisting you, that means they're not fighting with you, right?
Correct.
Force can still be used, right?
Yes, in certain instances.
Right.
Depending on, again, the suspect's actions.
Again, including joint manipulation, pressure points, escort holds, or what we would call just a restraint, right?
Yes, and again, a lot of that depends on what the police response should be at that time. If it's where the officers decided that this person needs to go to jail, they're going to take them into custody, then those would come into play. If it's just more of a, hey, can we talk to you, or detaining them, then it may just be verbalization. So it just depends on the circumstances.
And obviously, if we want to protect that person, and we know that EMS is on its way, we can continue to restrain that person for EMS if they have a medical need for EMS, right?
It depends on the circumstance.
And ultimately, it's dependent upon the reasonable officer analysis, right?
Yes. And what's expected from that specific agency, what their expectations are of the officer's performance, as well as best practices as well. Those are taken into consideration.
And ultimately, under the Graham versus Connor analysis, it's the specific facts of the specific case. Agreed? What the officer is seeing at the scene, right?
Yeah, when we're talking about force, correct.
Yep. All right. Now, again, you've had an opportunity to review a lot of the Minneapolis Police Department's training materials,
Yes, sir.
some of which you found useful and some of which you didn't, right?
Yes.
Would it be fair to say that your review of those materials were more focused on defensive tactics, use of force training, and policies and things of that nature?
Correct.
And so I'm presuming that the more recent materials would be more illustrative or informative to you informing your opinions, right?
Yes, based on what was current at the time of the incident.
Right. And you have seen the workforce director, the list of the programs that Officer Chauvin took?
Yes.
And you're familiar that Officer Chauvin, according to those records, took Phase 1 defensive tactics in the year 2020, March of 2020.
Yes, I believe so.
Did you review Phase 1 defensive tactics training materials for March of 2020?
I believe I did, yes.
If we could take this down, Your Honor. And just showing the witness. Can you see what's in front of you, sir?
Yes.
You'd agree that this appears to be the training materials for the 2020 in-service Phase 1 that would have been seen by Officer Chauvin.
Yes.
And
That
if
was
we-
one slide, yes.
And if we just look at the presentation, this is a presentation that largely deals with demonstrations, protests, crowd control, right?
Yes.
Large crowds, small crowds, things of that nature, right?
Yes.
This would have been training that Mr. Chauvin had roughly a month or two before this incident, right?
Correct.
Does this appear to be a true and accurate copy of what you would have reviewed?
Yes.
I have previously marked this as Exhibit 1032, and I would move for its admission.
Is this the single slide, counsel?
The entire program.
All right. Any objection?
Yes, Your Honor. Foundation.
Bates is $29.71 to 21096. It's the 2020 use of force in service. Large crowd management overview.
And your objection continues?
It does, Your Honor. We just have one moment.
Yeah.
No objection.
I'm sorry, no objection?
No objection.
All right. 1032 is received.
I'm showing you what I believe is slide 39 of this, and I'd ask permission to publish. This is the Minneapolis Police Department training materials on dealing with crowds, right?
With large crowds.
Large
yes.
crowds. Officers are trained, crowds are dynamic creatures and can change rapidly, right?
Yes.
You'd agree with that.
In this particular training for large crowds, correct.
But even in small crowds, even if you have 10 people or 12 people, crowds are dynamic creatures, right?
In certain instances, yes.
And they can change very suddenly, right?
Yes.
Just a second, Your Honor. If we could take that. Oh, this is all. And I agree that this deals with larger crowds and larger protests.
Yeah, the training is specifically for mobile field force. I'm an instructor for mobile field force as well, so yeah, I'm familiar with
Right.
similar training.
Yep. And again, officers, they are experiencing this training, right?
Yes,
And they're taught never underestimate a crowd's potential, right?
correct.
And again, crowds being unique to the particular circumstances of a particular case, right?
Correct.
And so ultimately, when an officer is on scene and he's making a decision to use force and a crowd assembles, whether they're peaceful or not peaceful, an officer, a reasonable officer, has to be aware of what they're doing, right?
Absolutely.
And that can distract an officer.
In certain instances, yes.
And as people start trying to communicate to the officers, that can take their, whether it's, even if it's just peaceful, hey officer, hey Sergeant Stiger, let's talk. That's distracting that officer from what he or she is doing, right?
Yes,
Right?
it can.
It can. And an officer has to be prepared for the unexpected. A reasonable officer does, right?
Yes, they're always mitigating the risk.
And I understand that part of what an officer has to do is assess the words someone may be saying and comparing it to the tone of how they're saying it, right?
Yes.
That's what a
Yes.
reasonable officer does, right?
Yes.
If I say, hello, Sergeant Stiger, versus, hello, Sergeant Stiger, right? There's two different tones, and my tone can convey meaning.
Yes.
Agreed? And if I start calling you names, that conveys a meaning, right?
Yes.
And saying things like, you're a fucking pussy, you're a bitch, that conveys a particular intent. Agreed?
I wouldn't say an intent, no.
And a reasonable officer could foresee that or see that, perceive that as a threat.
Name calling, I would say it depends on the officer's training and experience.
Okay. But an officer, a reasonable officer, could perceive the words that people are saying and the tone that it is being said in as a threat or a risk to the officer's safety. Agreed?
A risk, possibly, but officers are typically trained that when it comes to verbal threats in and themselves, that you can't just use that only to justify force.
Now, you've had, again, an opportunity to review Minneapolis Police Department's training materials. Oh, if we could take this down, sorry. Can you see what's in front of you, sir?
Yes.
You reviewed, I presume, as a part of your analysis, the Minneapolis Police Department's crisis intervention technique training, right?
Yes.
And I'm not seeking to admit this, but officers are trained to look at potential signs of aggression, right?
Yes.
The Minneapolis Police Department trains its police officers how to potentially perceive an aggressive behavior of a person, right?
Correct.
And that includes raising voices, right?
Yes.
That includes people tensing muscles, right?
Yes.
Exaggerated gestures, pacing, right? That can be a sign of an aggressive behavior. Right?
Yes. Typically, those are when you're dealing with you're one-on-one with a specific subject or engaged in a specific call for service. That's
Right.
typically when the training is given is for that, when it's more of a one-on-one, when you're dealing with a subject one-on-one.
That's the training. But in terms of now you are an officer and you're engaged with the suspect, right? And somebody else is now pacing around and watching you and calling you names and saying you're a fucking pussy. This could be viewed by a reasonable officer as a threat.
As a potential threat, correct.
And in fact, when that happens, if you look at the slide in front of you, when how a person is talking to an officer, if they're mimicking them or rageful, officers are specifically trained to try to predict future behavior based on that, correct?
Yes, to prepare themselves.
Right. And when someone starts threatening you, it's a possibility that an officer can view that as a potential deadly assault is about to happen. That's what they're trained.
Yes, that's what they're trained. It says what is the person's likely behavior.
Now, you testified that, did you listen to every single thing that the crowd or the people were saying?
I attempted to, yes.
Right.
Some of it you can't make out, but yes, for the most part, yes.
And you would agree that if someone were to say, if you touch me like that, I would like to slap the fuck out of you, right? That could be viewed as a threat.
Yes.
Reasonable police officers need to have a higher level of awareness of a situation, don't they?
Yes.
And a reasonable police officer, you would want a reasonable police officer to be more situationally aware of everything that's happening around him or her than an average bystander, right? You'd
Yes.
expect that.
Usually that comes with training, experience, and tenure.
Now, there were some questions about the actual force that was applied in this case, and it's your professional opinion, is it not, that this appears to have Officer Chauvin's knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
And that you concluded that that was a deadly use of force, right?
Yes, based on the Mr. Floyd's actions or lack of action.
So in that context, you believe A, the knee was on the neck and applying pressure to the carotid artery?
Not necessarily in the carotid artery, but it was in the neck area and on the back.
And so, as a police officer, you're trained in prone handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
You're trained in ground defense, correct?
Yes.
And ground defense includes the prone restraint technique, right?
Yes, I mean, there's other terms for it, but yes.
What would you call that? The prone restraint technique.
Well, it depends on in what context you mean.
Right. So the prone control technique, is that a
Yes.
specific term you're familiar with?
Control on a person.
Right. You've heard the phrase
To
control
attempt
the,
to handcuffing?
Let's not talk over each other.
Sorry, sir.
Wait for the next question.
Yes, sir.
you've heard the phrase control the head, control the body?
Yes.
That's commonly what police officers are trained, right?
Yes, when it comes to handcuffing, correct.
And in ground defense, right?
Yes.
And in the context of ground defense or in handcuffing or continuing to restrain a police or a suspect, control the head, control the body, right?
Yes, when they are resisting.
And that these concepts are widely accepted throughout law enforcement in the United States.
Yes.
And so again, in the training materials you've reviewed, you can see there are photographs, correct?
Correct.
Of officers employing a knee to the head, right?
I didn't see officer employing a knee to the head, no.
Sometimes to the neck.
Near the neck area, correct, yes.
And the specific technique that you're trained is for an officer to put his knee into what would be the trapezius area, in between the shoulder blades at the base of the neck,
Yes,
right?
the base of the neck.
And that is standard protocol, standard police practice, and basically in every single department that you're familiar with.
That I'm familiar with, yes.
And you were trained that way.
Yes.
And there's the immediacy of the handcuffing, correct?
Correct.
And then there's the need to continue to control the suspect, correct? If they're resisting.
Yes.
And then there is simply holding someone or restraining them to decide what your next steps are going to be, right?
Yes, in most cases, however, especially in the last 20 years, officers are trained to, once you handcuff the person, even if they are still resisting, you still want to try to put them in a somewhat of a side recovery position or sit them up.
Even if they're still resisting.
Yes. And hold them down in the side recovery position. Or utilize a hobble.
You would agree that the Minneapolis Police Department are trained that when a person is handcuffed and then rendered unconscious, that officers need to use caution in unhandcuffing them to revive them?
No, I'm not familiar with that. No.
Did you, as a part of your analysis, review any training materials regarding the use of the lateral vascular neck restraint?
Yes.
Just looking in front of you, did you look at this training material?
Yes.
Officers are trained that if CPR is needed, to remove handcuffs first, right?
Correct.
And to use caution because the subject may revive agitated and ready to fight.
Correct.
You've had that training too?
Yes.
You've had that experience where someone is rendered unconscious, is revived, and fights you more?
Not that they passed out and then they came to, yes.
And then they fought you more?
Yes.
Looking at what's already in evidence, the 2019 use of force manual at slide 41. This is what we're talking about in terms of the prone arm control, right?
Yes,
And you see a photograph here. Officer's knee appears to be across into the shoulder blades and between the shoulder blades across the head and neck area of the person, right?
yes, as he's attempting to handcuff the person, yes.
Your Honor, not an objection, but just a pause. Would you please identify these?
That was, I have it listed as 1031. Or that's what I had it. I don't remember what you would use.
That's the 2019.
Off the record.
2019 use of force.
You say 1041.
Sorry. I'm referring to bait stamp 21464 was the 2019 defensive tactics that you introduced. Sorry.
We just take a brief pause. Sorry, Your Honor.
Your Honor, this is from Exhibit 126, which is already in evidence. I'd ask for permission to publish.
You mean,
Again, you see here, this officer's knee appears to be over the neck and head of the subject as he's attempting to handcuff him, correct?
Correct.
And so there are circumstances when the knee is put in this position, correct?
Yes, but officers are always cautioned to try to stay away from the neck as much as possible.
All right. We can take that down, Your Honor. Now, you were shown a series of photographs, the comparative photographs, and I just don't have a copy of that right now. I believe it was Exhibit 274, the one you just admitted. $254? I don't have that yet. There was a one photo. Would it be possible to publish that? The photo, if we could publish this. Exhibit in this upper right-hand corner, right?
Yes,
Mr. Chauvin, the right shoulder is down lower, right, than the left shoulder.
yes,
And that would be consistent with more of his weight being on his right side, correct?
yes,
We can take that down. And again, when we look at still photographs, what we miss is sort of the dynamics of what's happening, right?
yes,
So weight can be shifting from side to side at times,
correct.
right? And if an officer is, generally speaking, on his toes, the majority of the weight is going to be in the feet, right? That's what you're trained?
Yes, that's how officers are trained.
And so if his left leg, his foot is off to the side, he has no weight, or he has less weight on that side of his body because his foot is off to the side, right?
Yes,
And if his right foot, the toes are tucked under, that would be consistent with having the majority of the weight on the right side, right?
yes,
And again, in uses of force that you've used yourself, or in uses of force that you have reviewed, right? Oftentimes, these things, uses of force, leave injuries on a suspect, right?
yes,
And if the weight of a human being was placed in a particular area based on your training and experience at reviewing police uses of force, you would expect there to be injury where the majority of the weight exists, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation beyond scope.
Overruled. You may answer.
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. But obviously, medical doctors may be able to answer that better, right?
Correct.
You would agree that on May 25th of 2020, Minneapolis Police Department authorized the use of neck restraints, right?
Correct.
And that the conscious neck restraint was not considered a lethal use of force.
Correct.
So I would like to show you a series of photographs that were introduced yesterday, starting with Exhibit 1045. So before we go there, you would agree that some of the problems with photographs are that, again, it doesn't capture, a single photograph isn't going to capture the dynamics of what's happening, right?
In some cases, yes.
Weight can shift, right?
Correct.
In a video versus a still photograph, right?
Yes.
And positions can change, right?
Yes.
And those things can happen throughout the course of the time of use of force, right?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to show you and publish Exhibit 1045. I don't know if you've seen these, but these are stills from the body-worn camera. Oh, sorry, I gotta switch this. It's a little difficult to see through the glare here, but maybe you can see it better on your screen.
And if you have to stand up to see past the glare, feel free.
Thank you, sir.
In this area here, it appears that you can see Officer Chauvin's left leg,
Yes.
and that Officer Chauvin's shin appears to be sort of parallel to or over Mr. Floyd's left shoulder blade. Agreed?
It's hard to tell. It could be his neck or shoulder blade.
In this dip right in here, the area between the two shoulder blades, he's handcuffed, right? That causes the shoulders to sort of come back.
I'm sorry, you're referring to his left knee, correct? That's
Right.
what you stated, that his left knee?
Right.
Yes, his left knee appears to be, based on the photograph I'm looking at, near the neck area of Mr. Floyd.
In between the shoulder blade here and what would be the shoulder blade behind his hand.
Above it. I wouldn't say it was in between it. It's more, it looks like it appears to be more above the shoulder blades than it does on the shoulder blades or below it.
Almost resting on the shoulder blade.
Above, I would
You would say
call
it's
it above, yes.
All right. But it appears to be angled in towards the cruiser, correct?
Yes.
Showing you, oops, I'm going to display that again. That being at 2023-32, right?
Yes.
Again, you can see Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade here a little bit more pronounced.
Yes.
It appears to be above the shoulder blade, correct? Mr. Chauvin's, Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade is a little more pronounced. Mr. Chauvin's shin appears to be, or calf, appears to be above the shoulder blade,
Correct.
angled in towards the squad car, correct?
Slightly, yes.
Showing you 1047. This is now at 2027. Appears to be a different angle now, right?
Yes.
And you can get a much clearer view of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee.
Yes.
And again, here you've got the shoulder blade shoulder blade, Mr. Chauvin's knee is sort of at the base of the neck, right?
Correct, I would agree.
And looking finally at Exhibit 1048. You can see Mr. Floyd's head in this picture, correct?
Yes,
And it gives you, again, a depth perception of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee relative to the neck of Mr. Floyd.
somewhat, yes.
Now, if we could take this down, Your Honor. I'd like to show you what has been introduced into evidence as Exhibit 1020, which on the left-hand side of your screen, you see that appears to be the bystander video.
Yes,
On the right-hand side, that's from Mr. King's body-worn camera.
yes.
You'd agree that at this point, based on everything that we've seen in the same photographs, on the left-hand side, it appears that Mr. Chauvin's knee is on Mr. Floyd's neck.
Yes. More of the base of the neck.
And from Officer King's body-worn camera, it appears that it was more at the base of the neck, in between the shoulder blades, right?
Yes,
And in fact, as you review some of the videos, while Mr. Floyd was in the prone position, there are points in time at which Mr. Floyd picks up his head and moves it. Agreed?
he attempted to early on, yes. He was stating he couldn't breathe, so I assumed he was attempting to try to breathe better.
But he was able to lift up his head at some points, turn it. Correct?
Slightly, yes, he attempted to.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, to clarify a little bit on the, thank you. To clarify a little bit on the known risk that you testified to with respect to positional asphyxia.
Yes,
Okay. Is the risk related to the pressure on the neck or the pressure on the body?
it's the pressure on the body. Any additional pressure on the body complicates breathing more so than if there was no pressure at all.
And so the placement of the knees, even if there can be shifting between the neck, the base of the neck, the point is that both of the defendant's knees were on Mr. Floyd's body during the entirety of the restraint period. Is that right?
Yes,
I want to ask you some questions about what may have been apparent to the defendant when he first got on the scene. You were asked some questions about being dispatched, and you know the term Code 4, correct?
correct.
And were you aware that prior to the defendant arriving on the scene, that Officer Lane had called Code 4?
Yes, I believe so, in reviewing some of the documentation and things of that nature.
And what does that mean?
That means that everything is okay, that we have the suspect in custody.
So at least at the time the defendant arrived, he would have been aware, based on the totality, that Code 4 had been called.
Yes,
I'd like to direct your attention to the moment in time when he would have arrived. You can pull Exhibit 43 which is, for the record, Officer Lane's body-worn camera. And I'd like you to begin displaying at timestamp 20:17:20. I'm sorry, can't hear you. Hold on. Apologize. 47. If- All right, well, we see it at, you can leave it at 20, or where it was. Yeah, go ahead. All right, so we see in the still frame, and now for the record, the timestamp is 20:17:20. At this point in time, we see Officer Tao, and would have been next to him, the defendant, arrive. Is that right?
Yes, I believe you can see his shoulder and the circle that you have.
And I'd ask to begin publishing to the jury.
Please, I'm not trying to win. I'm not trying to win. I get on the ground, anything. I can't stand this shit, man. He know it. He know it. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
As you get in this car, we can talk.
I'm claustrophobic.
I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me.
God, I'm claustrophobic, man.
Get in the
Well, I have a
car.
gun over here. I'm going to pull you in.
Get in the
Can you
car.
get me in the front? Please.
No, you're not getting in the
I'm
front.
claustrophobic.
Get in the car.
Okay, man, okay. I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy. Oh, God. Man. Oh.
Now, and you can take that down. Sir, in assessing an individual in the totality of the circumstances that would have been apparent at the scene, were you able to detect any indication that Mr. Floyd was under some sort of distress?
Based on his comments and based on his actions, yes, it was a possibility.
And is that something that would have, apparently Officer Chauvin, the defendant, would have seen that? Is that correct?
Yes,
And would a reasonable officer have taken that into account?
yes.
Now, sir, you testified that the force that was used here during the restraint period by the defendant was in fact excessive. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked on cross to distinguish between the standard, or to comment on the standard of objectively reasonable force. Is it your opinion then, to a degree of professional certainty, that the force that you've identified as applied by the defendant during the restraint period, was it objectively reasonable or not objectively reasonable?
It was not objectively reasonable.
And is that then the basis for saying it was excessive?
Correct.
You were asked about different techniques for de-escalation and the telling of someone to relax. I'd like you to comment on the context in which Mr. Floyd was told to relax by the defendant.
It appeared in the video that he was told to relax as he was stating that he was in a medical distress. He couldn't breathe and that he was in pain.
And so, again, the context, the words of the defendant versus the actions, telling someone to relax when you're sitting on top of them, is that an effective de-escalation technique in your opinion?
Overruled. You can answer if you have an opinion.
Not necessarily.
As to an officer, a reasonable officer, reassessing and reevaluating the situation, they also have to take in information related to a subject's potential medical condition. Is that right?
Yes.
Would you agree with the statement, in your custody, in your care?
Yes. I
What
do
does
agree.
that mean?
That means once you take someone into custody, then you're responsible for their care.
And can you, as an officer, simply opt not to believe them?
No,
You have to consider the context, correct?
correct.
And
We're obligated to in most cases.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. Could you please repeat that?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. You're obligated to. It's part of your duty.
And in the context that you saw here, in which Mr. Floyd was manifesting some distress, did you believe the defendant have an obligation to at least take that into consideration in the totality of circumstances when considering to continue the type of force he was applying?
Absolutely. As the time went on, clearly in the video you could see that Mr. Floyd's his health was deteriorating. His breath was getting lower, his tone of voice was getting lower, his movements were starting to cease. So at that point, as a officer on scene, you have a responsibility to realize that, okay, something is not right, something has changed drastically from what was occurring earlier, so therefore you have a responsibility to take some type of action.
Sir, you were shown some training materials that included photographs of officers in positions in which they would have their legs on the subject's back and the base of the neck. Is that right?
Yes,
And in the photograph, you were shown that subject was not yet handcuffed, was he?
no, he was not.
And the purpose of situating oneself on a subject is to gain control in order to handcuff the individual.
Yes.
And what is the officer supposed to do after they handcuff the individual?
Immediately sit the person up or put him in a side recovery position.
You were asked to comment on sort of the notion that some things that law enforcement do, have to do, uses of force, are not attractive to the public. Is that right?
Correct.
And in fact, you were asked about a presentation that you had given relative to that called, was it Awful But Lawful?
Yes.
And to be lawful, the force must be objectively reasonable, correct?
Correct.
And if it isn't lawful, then what's left?
Well, the whole premise of the presentation was that in certain situations, based on a policy or a particular law, even though the situation may be deemed lawful in the community's eyes, in the use of force is awful. So it was stating that, hey, in these situations, you can have a situation where by law it looks horrible to the common eye, but based on the state law, it's lawful.
But if it's not objectively reasonable and it's not lawful, then it's just awful.
Correct.
Right, nothing further.
Any requests?
You were not personally there that day, correct?
The day of this incident? Correct.
Correct. And you would not have known how people were feeling, correct?
Correct.
You would not know how they felt in terms of their perception, correct?
Correct.
You would not know how Mr. Floyd's body felt at that moment, correct?
Only what he was verbalizing.
I'm talking about in terms of the stiffness or tension of his body.
Correct.
And again, in terms of your use of force reviews in the past, you said you're a peer reviewer. How many reviewers look at an incident in the terms of a use of force?
From start to finish? Numerous. So in Los Angeles Police Department, it starts with the sergeant who's doing the investigation. Then from there, it will go to the watch commander, who happens to be typically a lieutenant or another sergeant, and the training coordinator. Then they make recommendations, and then they send it to the captains of the division. And at that point, the captains would then send it to the bureau. and that's where I was at one point as well. Then the Bureau makes recommendations, and then it gets sent up to another unit, and they make the final recommendation in that. In regards to more serious ones where I was a peer member, it goes from the investigators to the Use of Force Review Board, which is a 5-member board, 4 command staff and a peer.
And that peer review board, the 5 people, they make recommendations to move up the chain, right?
Yes, so they make recommendations. I'm sorry.
No, I was
Okay.
itching my face.
They make recommendations to the chief of police, then the chief of police reviews it, and he makes recommendations to the police commission. And the inspector general's office also reviews all the evidence as well, and they make recommendations. In most cases, they concur with the chief, but some cases they disagree. And then finally, a presentation is made to the police commission, and the police commission at that point makes the final decision.
So there's layers of review, right?
Correct.
And ultimately, in terms of just that 5-member review board, right? The one that you were describing,
Right.
are those decisions always unanimous
No,
as to whether or not it was a reasonable use of force?
no, it's not.
And sometimes those 5 people, they may disagree with each other, right?
Yes, we have a something what we call a minority report. I've actually written a couple of those myself. But yes, if one person or a number of people on that board will disagree, then that the ones that disagree, the minority have to do a report, basically telling what their case is or why they disagree.
Right. So even within that process, there is 5 potential police officers who can disagree with each other.
Correct.
All right. I have no further questions.
All right, thank you, Sergeant.
Thank you, sir.
We appreciate your time. You are excused.
Thank you.
Let's do one more witness, at least start.
Your Honor, the state would call Special Agent James Reyerson to the stand.
Would you raise your right hand, please? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Let's see, please. And if you feel comfortable doing so, take off your mask. Let's start with you giving your full name, spelling each of your names.
James, James, Reyerson, Reyerson.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Can you tell us what your current occupation is?
I'm currently a senior special agent with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
So just in general, what does a senior special agent do? What does your job entail?
So I'm currently assigned to the newly formed Use of Force investigation group. We conduct criminal investigations into uses of force incidents.
Are you a licensed peace officer?
Yes, sir.
Obviously, you're not wearing what we typically think of as a police uniform. Is that, when you work, do you have a uniform?
Generally, no. We're generally plain clothes.
Okay. And you mentioned, when did you first become licensed as a peace officer?
I started my law enforcement career in 2007.
And so let's run through your education and work experience for your job as a peace officer. First of all, did you obtain a 4-year undergraduate degree?
I did.
Can you describe or tell the jury what that is?
I have a Bachelor's of Science in Criminology from the University of Tampa
What year did you achieve that?
in 2006.
And after that, did you go to work in the field of law enforcement?
I did.
Where were you first hired to work in law enforcement?
I started my career at the New York City Police Department, the NYPD.
And so did you do some training then to be an NYPD officer?
I did. The NYPD has a 6-month training academy that I successfully completed.
And is that when you then obtained your license to be a peace officer?
Yes, sir.
And that was about what year?
Approximately 2007.
And when you became, well, let me ask you this. How many years did you work for the NYPD?
Approximately 4.5.
And can you describe for the jurors in what capacity you worked as a peace officer in New York City.
So as a police officer, initially assigned to the 32nd Precinct in Harlem, New York, my initial duties were as an impact officer, interacting with the community, addressing kind of quality of life issues. I was then transferred to Manhattan North Task Force as a task force officer. From there, I was assigned to address quality of life issues as well as violent crime issues, narcotics, and guns.
So all that time spent on the streets, essentially.
Correct.
And at some point, did you leave the New York City Police Department?
I did.
And what was the next job that you took in law enforcement?
I was hired as a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA.
And what year was that?
It was approximately 2011.
And what were your duties as a DEA agent?
Primarily to address large-scale, long-term investigations into narcotics.
Into what?
Narcotics,
Got it.
drugs.
And you had to do some training for that job, I assume?
Correct, yes, sir.
And how long was the training for that job?
Approximately 4.5 months at Quantico, Virginia.
And what kind of, after doing the training, were you assigned to a specific location?
I was, sir, yes.
And where were you assigned?
Initially to an enforcement group in New York City, and then I was transferred down to Nogales, Arizona, where my primary responsibility was investigating cartel activity.
And when you say cartel, we're talking drug cartel.
Correct, sir.
And at some point then, did you leave the DEA?
Yes,
And what year was that?
around 2013,
Why?
to move back to Minnesota.
And when you moved, when you say back to Minnesota, had you been here before?
Yes, this is where I'm from.
So when you went to the New York City Police Department, that was a change of locations for you.
It was, yes, sir.
So about 2013, you said you came back to Minnesota?
Correct.
And did you find work in a related law enforcement field?
Yes, sir.
Describe that for the jurors, please.
I went to corporate investigations, focused on insurance, white-collar based kind of work.
And during that time period, did you complete some more education?
I did, yes, sir.
And tell the jurors what that was.
I received my master's in business administration from Southern New Hampshire,
What year was that?
approximately 2014.
And at some point, did you leave that corporate investigative work?
Yes, sir.
Where'd you go from there?
I went to the Metro Transit Police Department
That's here in
here
Minnesota?
in Minneapolis.
And how long did you work there?
A very short time.
Okay. Where'd you go from there?
I was hired by the State of Minnesota Fraud Bureau as a special agent.
So is that part of the state government?
Correct.
What agency is that?
Department of Commerce.
When you worked at the Department of Commerce, were you a licensed peace officer?
Yes, sir.
Probably a lot of people don't know that there are licensed peace officers in the Department of Commerce, right?
Yes, sir.
What kinds of investigations did you do at the Department of Commerce?
Primarily white-collar investigations.
And at some point, did you leave the Department of Commerce then?
Yes, sir.
And where did you go after that?
The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension,
And when were you hired by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension?
2018.
And that's where you are today still?
Correct, sir.
So initially licensed in 2007,
Yes, sir.
did you maintain your license as a peace officer during that entire time period?
No. I did
When?
not. From about middle of 2013 to 2016, I was not.
And that's when you were working?
From the middle of 2013, sir, to about 2016, I was not.
And that's when you were doing the corporate work?
Correct.
As a licensed peace officer, you are required to take some ongoing educational credits, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you've done all that throughout your career, with the exception of that 2-year period.
Yes, sir.
When you were hired at the BCA in 2018, what were you hired to do?
I was hired within the Metro Homicide Unit, so we investigated major homicides as well as officer-involved incidents.
When you're hired at the BCA, are you required to go through some training specific to working for the BCA?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe for the jurors the kind of training that you had to do when you started with the BCA?
There's training that's involved with writing search warrants, report writing, as well as some tactics, interview and interrogation as well.
And you also have to spend some time at the medical examiner's office?
Yes, sir.
Describe that for the jury, if you would.
I recently completed the forensic pathology program at the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office, where I was present with the medical examiners conducting autopsies.
And are you currently working on an additional educational goal?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the jurors what that is?
I'm currently a third-year doctoral student at St. Mary's University of Minnesota, focused on education and leadership.
Now, you have told us that you work for the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension,
Yes, sir.
commonly referred to as the BCA, correct?
Correct.
Can you describe for the juries, what is the BCA?
So the BCA is a state law enforcement agency. We are under the umbrella of Department of Public Safety, kind of delineated into 4 divisions. The investigative division that I'm a part of, we have information services, a laboratory, as well as a training section. And we provide services to law enforcement agencies as well as to the community.
And so your jurisdiction is generally where?
State of Minnesota.
And on May 25th of 2020, what were your duties as a special agent?
So I'm currently the case agent and lead investigator for this investigation, so I was notified of the incident fairly quickly.
And you mentioned earlier about currently having a different assignment. Can you
Yes.
explain to the jury how your assignment has changed from May 25th of last year to today?
So back then I was in the Metro Homicide Unit, which investigated both homicides as well as officer-involved incidents. There's a newly formed Force Investigations Unit that I'm now a part of that solely focuses on investigations involving use of force.
You mentioned earlier the term case agent.
Correct.
What does that mean?
Case agent is another term for the lead investigator on a particular case.
And obviously you're here today to testify about the incidents that led to the death of George Floyd last year, correct?
Correct.
And you were the case agent for that case?
Yes, sir.
And when you are the case agent, are you responsible for knowing the course of the investigation?
Yes, sir.
Being involved in all aspects of the investigation?
Somewhat, yes, sir.
And that runs from beginning to end?
Yes, sir.
So taking you back to May 25 of 2020, you got called out regarding this incident?
Yes, sir.
Can you just describe for the jurors how you get that initial call and what you do in response?
So my supervisor called me at approximately 9:45, Agent Phil, and informed me there had been an incident that occurred in the confines of Minneapolis involving Minneapolis Police Department. It was determined that myself, Agent Phil, and Agent Scott Mueller would all report to City Hall. So we met at City Hall, Minneapolis City Hall, and then it was determined that Agent Mike Phil would head to 38th and Chicago, the scene, and myself and Agent Scott Mueller would head into room 100 at Minneapolis City Hall.
And so did you understand essentially why you, as BC agents, were being called to this incident?
We knew that some form of critical incident had occurred, but at that point we didn't have a huge amount of information.
And when you use the term critical incident in this context, what did it mean to you at that time?
An incident involving a police officer and potentially a civilian that could have caused harm.
So on May 25th of 2020, was the BCA responding to calls of critical incidents within the city of Minneapolis?
Yes.
And so had you developed, that is the BCA, a process for responding to those calls?
Yes, we have critical incident protocols.
And when you arrived with the other agents at City Hall, that's where the administrative offices of the Minneapolis Police Department are, correct?
Correct.
And so then at some point, the decision is made for Mike Phil to go to the scene at 38th and Chicago.
Yes, sir.
And that you and Agent Mueller then wait around or stay at City Hall, correct?
Correct.
And when you arrived there, did you guess, give what we call a briefing about what was known so far?
Yes, sir.
And did you learn who the involved officers were?
We did, yes, sir.
And who were those officers that you learned at that time were involved?
Officer Derek Chauvin, Officer Alexander King, Officer Blaine, and Officer Tao.
And in the course of, well, I guess I should ask it this way. Did you then initiate the critical incident protocols for this incident?
I did, yes.
And as part of that, taking photographs of each officer?
Yes, sir.
And were those officers there at City Hall that evening?
Yes, sir.
I should ask you, I guess, you said you initially got the call about 9:45 p.m.?
Correct.
Do you recall about what time it was that you arrived at City Hall?
Approximately 30 to 40 minutes later.
And yeah, can we put this up just for the witness, please? I'm going to show you Exhibit 279. Do you recognize that photograph?
Yes, sir.
And did you, in fact, take that photograph?
Yes, sir.
When was that photograph? Well, does this appear to be a true and accurate representation of what you saw when you took that photograph that evening?
Yes, sir.
All right, offer Exhibit 279.
Any objection? 279 is received.
I'd ask to publish it, Your Honor. And do you recall approximately when this was taken?
Shortly after I arrived at City Hall.
And through subsequent investigation that you've done, did you learn the approximate weight of the defendant around this time period?
Yes, sir.
And what was that weight?
Approximately 140 pounds.
I'm sorry?
140 pounds.
And as a police officer since, what, approximately 2007, right?
Yes, sir.
You're familiar with what I call the duty belt, the equipment that he's wearing?
Yes, sir.
Can you just describe for the jurors, in general, what is present on his duty belt?
Initially, firearm, handcuffs, mace. Usually there's a radio holder and a radio associated with that as well, and multiple magazines.
The magazine is what?
A magazine holds the bullets for the firearm.
And any body armor that he is currently wearing?
Yes, it appears as though he has a vest on.
Based on your experience as a peace officer, are you able to estimate the approximate weight of the equipment that the defendant is wearing in this photograph?
Approximately 30 to 40 pounds.
Okay, we can take that down, thank you. Now, while you're there at City Hall, did you endeavor to collect some other items of evidence or for the investigation?
Yes, sir.
And what other items did you acquire?
Part of our critical incident protocols is acquiring the officers involved's uniform as well as their equipment, including their firearm.
And did you also acquire some videos?
Yes, sir.
And on May 25th of 2020, were you aware that Minneapolis police officers wear body cams?
Yes, sir.
And did you acquire then the body cam videos for the 4 involved officers?
Yes, sir.
And can you just describe for the jurors how that process is done?
The Minneapolis Police Department Crime Lab retains the actual physical body-worn camera, downloads it, and provides it then to the BCA, to me.
And so you acquired those 4 body cam videos?
Yes, sir.
In the course of the investigation, you've acquired some other videos as well.
Yes, sir.
With regard to the body cam videos of the 4 involved officers, you have watched all of those, have you?
Yes, sir.
Those have a time stamp on them, correct?
They do, yes, sir.
And in your review, do they appear to be consistent with each other in their timestamps?
Yes, sir.
While you were at City Hall, did you collect some other data about the incident?
Yes, sir. I collected a Cad Report.
And can you describe for the jury what is a Cad report when you say that?
Cad Report is a transcription of all the radio traffic associated with a specific incident.
Any other data then that you acquired there?
The milestone video.
And what is that?
Milestone video is a video, city video that is positioned at the street level at various places throughout the city.
And so you learned that there was a milestone video of the location of this incident,
Yes, sir.
and you obtained that.
Yes, sir.
How about any information about the 911 call or that traffic?
Yes, I also retained the audio file from the 911 call.
While you were there, at some point, did you learn about a Facebook video of the incident?
Yes, sir.
How did you learn about that?
Deputy Chief Eric Forrest notified me of a video that had surfaced on Facebook.
And were you able to watch that video at that time?
Yes, sir. I was shown the video shortly thereafter.
Do you recall if you watched the whole thing or parts of it?
I believe it was a portion of the video.
And throughout your investigation of this case, have you come to learn that who was the person making that video or filming that?
Darnella Frazier.
So after your duties at City Hall, did you proceed to the scene?
Yes, sir.
And when you arrived at the scene, were there other BCA individuals there?
Yes, sir.
Who all was there still at that point?
I met with Agent Mike Phil and crime scene team lead Mackenzie Anderson.
Do you recall about what time it was that you arrived at the scene?
Approximately 2 to 3 in the morning of the 26th.
And you mentioned the crime scene team. Can you just describe very generally for the jurors what you mean by the crime scene team?
Crime scene team is members of our BCA laboratory who go out and forensically collect evidence in support of criminal investigations.
So they investigate crimes at the scene.
Yeah, they collect and process crimes at the scene.
And who was the, well, let me ask you this way. How many members are there of the crime scene team typically?
Typically 2 to 3 and a special operations agent who is solely assigned to take video and photographs.
And so there is a team leader?
Correct.
And who was that for this case?
Mackenzie Anderson.
When you arrived at the scene, did you learn about some vehicles at the scene that were involved in the incident supposedly?
Yes, sir.
And what were those vehicles? Can you describe them?
A I believe, blue in color Mercedes-Benz and a Minneapolis Police Squad Car 320.
And so when you say the Mercedes-Benz, do you know what style of vehicle that was?
I actually don't. It's an SUV.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was trying to get at, I guess. And so those two vehicles, did you see them at the scene?
Yes.
Do you recall where they were located?
I believe they were on the south side of 38th.
And with regard to the squad car, the Minneapolis Police Squad car, did you learn anything about contents of that vehicle?
Yes.
What did you learn?
I learned that two $20 bills were in a manila envelope in the trunk area of the vehicle, as well as other items that related to this incident.
So what did you do with regard to that envelope?
I seized those at the scene, that envelope at the scene.
Okay. And so you, by seizing it, you took it with you?
Correct.
And did you open up that envelope and see what its contents were?
Initially, yes.
And so you mentioned $20 bills, correct?
Correct.
And, Your Honor, if I could show the witness only, please, Exhibit 198. Sure.
Members of the jury, we're going to take our lunch break at this time. Let's try and reconvene at 1:15. And actually, you may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yeah.